Okay, folks, I reckon we'll move into the question and answer session now, and so you've had a few minutes to sort of think about what was said and had a chance to have a discussion amongst yourselves. So I'm just going to open it up for questions from the floor. We've got Leet here on the roving mic, so who'd like to ask the first question to any of our panel? Thanks, Michael.
Yeah, I spoke to Chris about it, but he said it's in the fine print, but we couldn't find it. Years ago there was a case where I think it was one of Lan's men was out, or people were out doing something to a trial site. A spray plane turned up, which wasn't that good. But the farmer actually didn't know the spray plane was going to turn up either. It was booked, a week ago, and then they had a break in the weather and went out there and started spraying. And one of Lan's people was in the crop. Nothing happened untoward, but it was just a case in point of what can go wrong if there's not good communication. I don't think it's in that agreement. Chris couldn't seem to find it. He thought it was, but people are going on site, they give notice.
Yeah.
It is in there.
It's not obvious.
Okay, we've got 2 mics.
The thing is, that's the sort of thing that, if you're developing your agreement, then make sure it's in there. As I said, there was a huge, very scary document that was about 3 times as long as this, and we sort of cut it down, and we'll just have to relook. For ours, that should have been in there. Certainly something I always do with our farmers.
No, I'm just making it.
And that's a good example of what should be in, so that both the farmers and the workers are working together. There is something in there that says about 10 days working notice of any crop walks and stuff. But
that's a bit. Yeah.
But often, last week I was going out to do something on one of the paddocks and made sure I let the farmer know beforehand.
Okay, question from Emma, and then another one from Flick up the back.
Equally on that I've got a loud voice. Equally on that point, I'm contracted by the group to harvest, and my yield monitor doesn't work for whatever reason. What are the ramifications? How, you've got the agreement, but what does it actually mean? I don't mean to be putting you on the spot. It's something that we've had in Spa happen a couple of times. So.
How do you police this and how do you get restitution?
Yeah.
I don't know, someone else might be able to answer that based on their own experience of what happens if the yield monitor doesn't work.
Anyone got that experience? I know a few have had the experience.
We just sort of go, oh, bugger, basically.
Well, maybe you just go, oh, bugger,
But if we have an agreement now saying we will harvest and we've actually then put the process in place. I think it's a great idea, don't get me wrong, but if we're going to start having these things, we need to understand what the...
And I guess, Emma, if there was money changing hands in that case, the farmer was contracted, which often they're not, they're the in-kind support, then that might present another level of complexity, mightn't it? But at the moment, I guess most do it as part of the contractual obligations, but do it in kind, so there's no money changing hands. So it's a tough.
You're talking about an agreement needs between the contractor and the organisation.
No, I'm talking, like in your agreement, you've got that the farmer will be harvesting those trial plots.
Yeah, that's right. But what I do is I actually don't ever rely on the yield monitor working. So that comes back to just how you intelligently run the trial. Like in terms of yield monitoring, I make sure I'm actually out there collecting the information in as many ways, and that's my responsibility. All I expect from the farmer is to be doing his best. It's not written as if saying, okay, well, if something happens that's untoward, then we're going to take everyone to court.
Yeah, I think that's a good answer, Chris. Just cover your bases, and at the moment, some of the technology's been unreliable. So, Felicity.
Yep.
What's it?
So put enough white pigs out there they can't break through.
Yeah, indeed. Flick had a question, I think.
Yeah, once around next slide.
Mine's around the NVT sites, Bill, and this might actually be a little bit regarding you. Like, I understand what Gemma's trying to achieve, and that's fantastic. I think it's a great idea to have these farm site agreements. Often the MacKillop Group are running things in conjunction with NVT sites, and I'm just wondering whether you could have something on the NVT site that sits on the road with the grower contact number and please contact before you enter this farm.
Yeah, Rob Wheeler's in the audience up the front here. Rob, you got a comment to make on that? Seeing as you are managing so many of the NVT sites, is that a consideration? It's a good point.
With the NVT sites, we've had farmer agreements in place now for 4 or 5 years. That was part of what GRDC requested in the first instance. So part of the reason we set those up was because we were compensating, we allowed for the compensation for farmers. So you needed to have some paperwork in place to be able to compensate them. Yep. All the NVT sites have signs on them with the GRDC banner and so on them, and a trial trial contact. So probably would be a good idea to have the farmer's name on there as well, to be able to ring them out of courtesy. Yep. And there is a place on those signs to have that, so point taken.
Good point. Thanks, Lick. I think there's a question over there from Trent and then Greg.
Yeah.
And Jim.
I was just putting my hand up to talk about the yield monitors. At the stubble workshop the other week, discussion came up, and basically maybe it should be written into that contract that when the farmer's going to harvest it, he lets the researcher know, so the researcher can actually be there and write down the data as you go. So that's pretty straightforward really, but it just has to should be written into any of the agreements. The other question I had was the permit 7250 that looks like it's pretty useful. What sort of time frame is there for a farming systems group if they suddenly think on the 1st of May that they might want to do some stuff? Is that way too late? How long does it take that to get through the APVMA?
So Mike or Kevin? Mike?
Yeah, good question. That permit is just there, so you don't have to do any separate application or any other process. That permit is sitting there for use for anyone doing small scale permits. So at any point, providing you're following the conditions that are in the permit, you could start up a trial and do it as long as you're following those conditions. So there's no issue with timing.
So you have a permit in, so it may be clear that I understand that. So the Farming Systems Group would have that permit in place, and that's sort of ongoing, long-standing. Is that right?
That's right. It's a generic permit that is sitting there for anyone, doesn't matter who, to use, providing that they meet the conditions that I went through before.
So we don't even have to apply for it?
That's correct.
Right. Okay. Yep, good question. Greg, I think, and then Jim. Did you have a question still, or has it been answered?
No. I construed from what you were saying was something about the legal standing of this agreement. I mean, it's actually written quite into legal language, but is it supposed to be a legally binding document which has implications for litigation and all that kind of thing, as opposed to sort of an agreement, just to clarify matters? And I think if it's not intended to be a legal document, it probably should say that.
That's a good point, Greg, and we can certainly say that it's not a legal document. We don't want to end up in court, but the idea is that it clarifies the roles of everyone involved in the trial. So hopefully the investment in that trial is not wasted by something going wrong.
Jim.
Look, mine's more of a comment rather than a question. It just deals with the funding side of these projects from SAGAT's point of view. We have had trials that have been destroyed with chemical overspray and sheep getting in, and in one case property sold, and we've been able to negotiate our way through that. Within our funding agreements, we have the ability to pull funding if we're not happy with the way these trials are conducted. We haven't had to do that in the past. But having said that, nor have we funded these trials for an extra year because they've had a year that's mucked up. So it's very important as far as we're concerned that these things don't happen too often, because it's a case of probably 2 strikes and you're out as far as funding is concerned.
Good point, Jim. Emma, that question again?
Yes, this, I thought it was extremely interesting what Mike McManus had to say about the permit. With my communicator's hat on, from GRDC's point of view, we've always been told we are not allowed to write about anything that is off-label.
Yep.
2 points, it's incredibly difficult as a communicator to know what's off-label without spending a lot of time. Is it possible that groups, if they're using this permit, could clearly state that these are the chemicals that are off-label and that then we can report on them? So, sorry, they're off-label but under this permit, and we can say that in communication. Would that be possible and would that be acceptable? Maybe, Bill, you might want to...
Absolutely. No, just to reinforce the value of that question, Emma, because that's exactly the situation we're facing at the moment. I'll give you the example with the IMI-tolerant products and the use of Glean, Logran and Ally. Oops, did I say that? We actually aren't able to report on that, so GRDC has this issue as well. So at the moment we're not actually able to talk about some of the products that are causing a problem because they are off-label and yet they are being used out there. So I think this is the crux of the issue.
Yeah, thank you.
John.
I'll just start off with the almost legal agreement that was circulated previously, and that triggered my thoughts about what you can actually say about results and off-label use, etc. So I think it's worthwhile for someone on behalf of the group to get a legal opinion on a couple of clauses in the APVMA legislation, which I can identify and pass on to you. So there is a need to work out how you can talk about off-label use. I don't have an instant answer, by the way, but there's 2 aspects to it. One is what you're allowed to say in regards to the APVMA legislation, and there's also the issue of negligence, if you like, common law, where in terms of providing advice or providing information, that you don't actually do that in a negligent fashion. Now, in the past, the agency I work for used some words to the effect about results from a limited number of trials and presented that information publicly. Whether that's a valid approach today, I'm not going to comment on, but I think it's a very important one that you should actually investigate in terms of of making people aware of the results of your work and getting the context right.
Thanks, John. Anybody else want to add a comment to that? Kevin?
I mean, I can't speak for GRDC, but my understanding, their concern, I think, comes back to this issue of duty of care. That if there are things being, I suppose, not so much promoted, but there's a concern, I suppose, about an implied recommendation, where it could be that you're talking about something's being used and you're promoting it at a field day and this type of thing, and people go away and do it, then potentially you could be legally liable. And I think that's where GRDC are coming from, that they're funding an awful lot of research and that potentially ends up resulting in, if you like, illegal or off-label use, that they potentially could end up wearing that liability. And that's what I think where, and may well have been an overreaction on their part, but I think that's where the concerns come from.
I think there's a very good example of this at the advisor updates held here recently. Chris Davey was presenting some results of some herbicide tolerance work he was doing on lentils. And he got up there and he put in, in grey, the off-label or the non-registered products. And one of the comments he made was, oh, actually I was trawling through this trying to make sure I had all my unregistered products covered, and there was Diron and Simazine being used in lentils. Now I can tell you that is a very common herbicide to be used in lentils across South Australia, Victoria, and guess what? It's not registered. And he made the comment, he said, I didn't realise that product wasn't registered. So spot on, Emma, like a lot of the whole of industry that is using and recommending this stuff sometimes does it unwittingly, unknowingly, and yet it's industry standard. And we're terrified about some of the new or old products that we're playing with being different for some reason. So I guess that's creating the confusion.
But sorry, could it come back to GRDC and SAGIT to say in their requirements that groups need to clearly identify which ones are off-label?
Yep.
Because all we've done is actually remove the discussion, and I can see, Kevin, what you're saying, but if we clearly can state this is under a permit, surely everybody can go, okay, I know that's off-label. It's my choice if I use it or not, but I know it's off-label.
I agree.
At the moment, it's just grey.
Yeah, absolutely.
If we avoid it.
Emma, I've hit the nail on the head, and my concluding remarks were that I think this is the point we're at, is that we're shying away from the discussion. We're not talking about what needs to be talked about, when in other cases with some herbicides we're just out there doing it. There is nothing wrong with being up front and saying this product's not registered. Here it is in the trial results saying that we trialled this, guess, shading grey, so grey means not registered. At least we can see that, and then we have, I'm sure, been more responsible in our discussion than not talking about it at all and suffering the implications of that lack of discussion. So I think, guys, we're out of time, but for the regulators and for anybody else involved in any permit work, Kevin, APVMA, your discussions with those guys, I think that's one of the big conclusions of the discussion today, is that we perhaps need to consider what's happening out there in the real world and not be afraid to have that dialogue, be conscious of that and move forward so that we can...
Yeah, I think you're right. I mean, but I think where GRDC, part of, I suppose, what's driving this from a GRDC perspective, at least with my dealings with GRDC, has been the whole issue of propyzamide. That in a way, I gather propyzamide was used extensively in WA in part of the original screening, when they were screening new varieties and this type of thing, I think just as a ryegrass control, but when it was basically Dow's product and a horticultural product, it was very expensive, and so that was fine. But then once the price came down, generics came in, got promoted, was used extensively, the GRDC is sitting back thinking, well, we've funded a lot of this work and now it's driving all this off-label use, and I think that's where part of the concern comes from. It may well be such that, if you're saying there are ways to deal with it, I know that from a research point of view that GRDC are comfortable with it's being the off-label usage, like being not promoted but talked about in like a peer-reviewed journal and these sorts of things. Not like it's complete strict verboten. But yeah, they're certainly sensitive about the idea of these things being talked about at grower meetings.
I think we have to leave it there. We're over time by a few minutes, but can you please thank the speakers? I think they did an excellent job. I've got a small gift for you here, so